Hi folks. Well, today, I thought I'd do a little bit of a little fun historical aside, and I thought I would tell you all about the lovely Highland cows that many of you will have seen if you've visited Scotland, and I'll tell you a bit of the history of this animal. Anyway, this lovely breed can trace its ancestry back over 4,000 years apparently, and to these fantastic Egyptian longhorn cattle that existed in the Pharaoh's times. So that's their ancestry. Variations of that cow were brought to Scotland by migrating Stone Age farmers, and the Highland cows you see today really developed in the Highlands of Scotland, and also out in the Outer Hebrides. That's the islands right off the west coast of Scotland. So that is where this breed developed. And as you probably know, if you've seen one, they're very easily recognisable by their big long horns, and they have this long shaggy coat. So it's a wonderfully hardy animal, the Highland cow, and it's been bred to withstand the cold and the wet conditions in the Highlands and Islands. And the funny thing is, although most people today see them as being red, when they see them, they see it's a sort of reddish colour. Actually, they do come. They are available, as you might say, in other colours. Anyway, I thought I'd run through just now some of the attributes of this amazing animal, because some of it's quite interesting, and then I'm going to talk about the history of it a bit more. A thing that I thought was very interesting was that what's called a breed standard, so in other words defining the standards of the breed, was created for Highland cows way back in 1885 in Inverness, and this actually makes Highland cows the oldest registered breed of cattle in the world apparently. And all registered owners that have to follow the standard for this breed. Now originally there were two different types of Highland cattle. One was what called the West Highland, and these were ones that were bred largely in the Outer Hebrides, out on the islands, and the weather conditions here tended to be much harsher, more rain, wind, and the grazing much poorer. So as a consequence of this, of these conditions, the West Highland cows tended to be smaller, and funnily enough, they tended to be more likely to have black coats and slightly longer hair. Again, probably because of the conditions. The other type of Highland cow was called the mainland, so it was obviously the ones that were bred up in the Highlands on the mainland of Scotland, and these were larger beasts than the island compatriots, because the pastures generally were richer, and they tend to come in a range of colours. Most frequently a sort of sandy brown and dun colour, I think it's called, or that reddish colour you see nowadays. However, both types have long since been crossbred, and there is no difference today. So there's just the Highland cow now. Just a couple of points. If you wanted to define whether it's a male or female, i.e. is it a bull or a cow, you can tell by their horns. So the bull's horns tend to grow forward and sometimes even downwards, so they're coming forward and downwards, and they're much wider. The cow's horns point slightly upwards, and they tend to be longer and finer horns. So that's generally the way that people would sense that's a cow or a bull. As I said, they are very hardy beasts, and their long hair is actually a double coat. So on the outside is this oily outer hair, long oily outer hair, sometimes reaching like 12, 13 inches long, and this helps to protect the animal from the driving rain and the wind. And then underneath this oily outer hair, it has this downy undercoat, which helps to keep it warm. So it's actually very well insulated, both from the rain and the wind, and also from the cold. So it's quite clever, I thought. Despite their appearance and the big horns, they actually are quite docile and friendly animals, and generally very good natured. They are, however, very protective of their young. So you shouldn't really be approaching them, and especially not if there were calves about, because they would look to protect their young. They have a very long lifespan, much more than most other breeds of cattle, and can live for up to 20 years. They also are famed, you might say, for being able to survive on poor grazing, and they are fantastic scavengers, so that they can hunt about and rake about and use those horns to rummage about to find something that they can eat. And in fact, they tend to they'll eat almost anything if it has some form of food value in it. And they have this amazing ability to thrive in pastures that are so poor that probably no other cattle would live, and would probably die if they were put into pastures like that. Generally throughout the world, groups of cattle are called herds, a herd of cattle, but a group of Highland cattle, Highland cows, is known as a fold, and this is because traditionally in winter time the cows were kept in these open shelters made of stone. You probably still see them. I mean, you do tend to still see them up in the Highlands at times. They don't have a roof. They generally just have walls. And this was to protect them from the weather at night, so they would be put into these folds, and so that name obviously stuck, and a group of Highland cows is called a fold rather than a herd. So the breed is in good nick. It's estimated that in the United Kingdom now there's about 15,000 of the Highland cows. And as well as being found in the Highlands and the Outer Hebrides, you will sometimes see them down further in the lowlands, but also they've been exported to other countries, and they now exist and are bred, I think, in these countries abroad. They're in Australia, Canada, United States, and I think Denmark and Finland in Europe, and I think they have Highland cattle societies in these countries for them. And as a mark of royal approval, in 1954, the young Queen Elizabeth II, our monarch, she ordered Highland cattle to be kept at Balmoral Castle, and they're still kept there today. So that's interesting. So the breed has done very well. It's a very hardy beast, can survive very well, as I've said, in very sparse pastures, and yeah, is doing well. Looking back at the history of things, that the Highland cows played such an important part in the economy of the Highlands and the islands. Originally, the crofters would keep them as what's called house cows, that would produce milk for the house, and then also would provide meat for the family. However, later on, they started to breed more cattle so that they could sell them, and these would be sold. Where they were aiming was to sell them to the very prosperous markets in England, where the meat was highly prized. So this became, a big industry. And what would happen is, in the summertime, the beasts would be taken up to the upland grazing to fatten them up. And whoever went with them, the herdsmen and who went with them, they would stay in these little stone buildings, temporary sort of buildings called sheilings. That's a phrase you still hear today when they're talking about houses, up in the Highlands. So that the herdsmen would stay there over the summer to look after them. And then when the cows were ready for market, they would be driven down through the mountains along these old Highland drove roads by the Highlanders, by the crofters, and markets were held where they could sell them. And the cattle markets, I think they were held in quite a few towns, but quite well-known ones were in Falkirk and in Crieff. And English buyers would come up to these markets, and they would pay good prices for high-quality Highland cows. So this was a great business for the Highlands and for the Highlanders. And as an example, in 1777, 90,000 head of cattle, of Highland cows, were sold in Falkirk alone at the market there. Now that's a lot of animals for a small country like Scotland. Some Highlanders would take the cattle to the markets and would sell them there, and that would be them finished. But it became quite a well-known thing that some of the Highlanders became drovers and were quite expert at this and quite renowned, I think, actually. And they would take on commissions to drive beasts south, all the way down into England to the markets, and they would go very far south. So not just into the north of England, right down to the Midlands and Lincolnshire and places like that, so they could access these markets down there, the prosperous markets. And they used to travel on these old drove roads again, so once they crossed the border and they were into England, the drovers tended to go along the top of the ridges of say the Dales and that, so really down the spine of England, and they did that because they needed to avoid being congested down in the valleys with other agricultural traffic, and horses and carts and things like that, because here they have this fold of Highland cows, and they've got to get them down to these markets. I think I saw a figure quoted that generally they would try an average, maybe about 15 miles a day, I think, something like that. Maybe a bit more, I don't, roughly round about that figure. And certainly down in England, there are still these old-fashioned, they're called drove-ins, and actually some of them are still called drove-in or the drovers inn or places, things like that, up in the dales and the hills, and these inns catered for these drovers, actually I've seen it quoted really that because you're talking about now back in the 1700s that really these Highland drovers were a bit like, they were a bit of forerunners of the the American Wild West cowboys. Sir Walter Scott, the famous Scottish author and poet, he wrote a great story called The Two Drovers, about Highland drovers, and he paints this vivid picture, of what their life was, and when they went on these long drives with these Highland beasts. taking them all the way down into England. And there's just a couple of things from that I thought were quite funny. Was that in one he says that the market had been very brisk, when they were selling the beasts up in Scotland, and several buyers had attended from the northern and midland counties of England, and English money had flowed so readily, he said, that it gladdened the hearts of the Highland farmers. So that must have been a great day for them that these English buyers had arrived with all their money, and they were able to sell their beasts. But coming back to the Highlanders who became drovers, Sir Walter Scott comments that they seem to be, particularly the Highlanders, as compared to other Scotsmen, the Highlanders seem to be masters of this, quite a difficult job, and quite a long, arduous job, really. And he said that it seemed to suit them, as well as the trade of war. So in other words, that the two kind of things that they like doing, fighting people, or going on these big long droves. So again, a wee bit like the cowboys, I think. And at night, apparently, the Highlanders tended to sleep with the beasts. No matter what the weather was, really, they would sleep out there with the beasts. And he quotes that many of the Highlanders never slept under a roof during this long journey on foot. They did it on foot all the way, and he quotes from Lochaber, that's up near Fort William, for those of you who've been there, from Lochaber to Lincolnshire. Now, that's a long way, that's a long journey. If you're maybe averaging 15 miles a day, on foot, sleeping out at night with the beasts, you'd have to be hardy, both the beasts and the men, to do that. And also he comments on what their diet was, and this did amaze me, was that they would take food with them, but not a lot. They would buy or barter food on the way, but what it used to be was oatmeal and onions, and they would then also have a ram's horn filled with whiskey, which he says was used regularly but sparingly every night and every morning. So presumably they existed on porridge and onions, and then had a whiskey at night and a whiskey in the morning to help them get on their way. I think it would be needed. So that's a kind of fascinating look, I think, about the history of this beast, how important it was, and how it created this whole, I was going to say, lifestyle and subculture of the drovers and the drove roads and the drove-ins and things like that, the cattle market, which must have been quite exciting things in those days for them to be happening. Certainly if they were selling, coming back to that Falkirk one, 90,000 beasts, that's a lot of animals to be there getting sold. The uses for the Highland cows, obviously they can produce milk, and as I said, they were originally used as a house cow to produce milk, but they will never make as much milk as what you would call production cows now, cows that are bred for milk production. So Highland cows will never do that. And also their milk has an extremely high butterfat content, which apparently some people do like, but it may be a sort of acquired taste. However, they were bred mostly for beef, and the good thing about the Highland cows, and I'm not sure how many people know this, I'm pretty sure that it's not that well known in Scotland, but the meat from the Highland cows is much leaner than most beef. And that's because the animal is kept warm, by that the thick coat, the two-layer coat. That's what the animal uses to insulate itself. It has the two layers we talked about before. So it doesn't have to put on this big layer of subcutaneous fat that most cows have, which they use to insulate themselves, you know. So the Highland cow doesn't have that. So the meat from Highland cows is much leaner, and therefore generally seen to be much better for human beings. And Highland cow, the beef from Highland cattle, you know, it tends to command a premium price because it has a very fine texture, very good flavour, very high protein content, and as I said, it's leaner, it's lower in fat, and lower in cholesterol. And it's even been quoted that it's lower in cholesterol than, say, chicken meat, which is pretty good for beef. So because of these attributes, the meat from Highland cattle, from herds, folds of Highland cattle, is gaining popularity, and not just more. I was going to say not just in Scotland, but certainly probably more abroad than, say, here at home. But it's a very strong message that I think they probably should be marketing it much more stronger, because health is very high on people's agendas these days, and good quality beef from a guaranteed breed, a well-maintained breed, is very important. I think another important aspect which again I think should be highlighted more, is that Highland cows are generally raised in what today's we would call a more environmentally friendly way. They are not intensively farmed, so this is not an intensively farmed animal, and it will be out there and it can survive out there on its own. It doesn't need to be put indoors and fed on whatever kind of food substitutes and things like that. And the good thing is, when we talk about sustainability, the lands that they, where they thrive up in the Highlands and Islands, are generally totally unsuitable for growing any alternative crops. Especially when you take into account the low temperatures and the huge, the high rainfall that this area receives, and yet here is a beast that is, absolutely suited to this environment, and therefore it is, it's very environmentally sustainable. It doesn't destroy the environment, and we don't have to do anything to it, and this beast can survive. And it's been proven that Highland cows can produce beef at a reasonable profit, given that they can command a premium price. So farmers can produce beef at a reasonable profit from land that would otherwise not be able to used for agriculture. It would just it wouldn't be possible to get anything from it. So I think that, those two aspects, the fact that its meat is much leaner and better for us, and also the fact that they are a very environmentally friendly and a very sustainable breed of animal, those were two issues that I thought, we as I say, we in Scotland should be promoting more about this wonderful animal. So that's a little history of this wonderful little animal. Maybe next time, if you're in Scotland or you see one, or who knows, you might see one in one of the countries abroad if they're about, these lovely animals, maybe just get that in your mind, that these amazing beasts, they're able to survive in environments where practically all other cows would die, and many other animals would die. They live longer. Don't know how they do it, but they live longer. They produce leaner, healthier meat. They have a very friendly and temperament. On top of all of that, they're also just lovely, lovely animals to look at, aren't they? So that if you ever see one again, keep all that in your mind. And just as a final thing, you may remember this picture. I'll just show you now. This was one of the winning pictures from a competition I ran before, and I just loved it. So I just thought, you know, if you've got a picture, a favourite picture of a Highland cow, put it into the comments and let everybody see all your fun pictures of Highland cows. Anyway, that's everything you need to know about Highland cows. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you do, as usual, perhaps like it and share it with your friends. I'm always keen to get the message out to everybody. And obviously I hope that we are all, in these continually difficult times, you know, we have all got to continue to be safe and well. But until we do all meet again, I just want to wish you all the very best from Scotland.